Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Kissinger, members, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. The topic is relevant and timely. I have to say it's an honor to be on this panel with Jessica Aro and Jakub Kalinski, two fighters against disinformation, and a pleasure to be here with my old colleague, Fred Kagan. The Russians may be leaders in state-sponsored disinformation, but they're not going to be the last. The democratic community, the free world, needs to face the challenge of Russian and other forms of contemporary disinformation while remaining true to our democratic values. As we learned during the Cold War, we must not and need not become them in order to fight them. I want to focus on what's to be done. First the Europeans, then the US. Europeans have moved since 2018 toward action to deal with disinformation. The EU approach includes strengthening the EU's capacity to identify and expose disinformation, and hopefully that includes strengthening support for East Stratcom, where Jakub Kalinski used to work. They've established an EU rapid alert system to spread news of disinformation campaigns in real time. Most important, the EU has negotiated and concluded a code of practice on disinformation with US social media companies, setting out terms of behavior and standards. The code notes that if progress is not satisfactory, the EU could turn to regulation. The EU is also looking at improving social resilience against disinformation, creating a European network of independent fact-checkers, launching an online platform on disinformation, and social media literacy. European governments, particularly France, Sweden, but others, perhaps in reaction to Russian hacking of the Macron campaign in 2017, have been active. The good news is that the EU and some European national governments have been addressing the disinformation challenge. The bad news is that EU implementation, even of its own plans, has been uneven. This is just beginning. The United States, though, and I'm sorry to say this, lags the EU, both in conceptual framing of the issue and actions to deal with it. This is not due to lack of awareness of the problem inside the administration, but leadership has been uneven. Nevertheless, there is work ongoing in the administration. State Department's Global Engagement Center is funding research and helping civil society groups and independent media on the front lines of the threat. US Cyber Command began operations ahead of our last congressional elections to deter Russian operations. USAID is supporting local media and civil society in the European countries most vulnerable to Russian disinformation. Department of Treasury has imposed sanctions on Russian entities tied to disinformation. The Senate has introduced sanctions legislation, so-called DASCA, which actually has some useful provisions on countering disinformation. These are good steps, but they lack the scope of what the EU has already tried to launch. There's no US equivalent to the EU Code of Practice. We need to have an all-of-government approach to the problem with the backing of the highest levels of the administration. The following might serve as an action plan for the US. US government needs to get organized. Somebody and some agency needs to own the problem, whether this is state, DHS, or a national counter-disinformation center with the backing of the president. Somebody needs to answer the phone when you want to call about disinformation.
This is, did you plan that?
Yes, sir, I did.
That was excellent.
Yeah. The US needs to work with its friends, starting with the European Union. We could stand up a transatlantic or G7 counter-disinformation coalition to pool our knowledge, set common standards, and use our regulatory power to greatest impact. Social media companies have happily moved beyond initial denial, but they need to keep cleaning up their platforms and reassessing online anonymity. The administration and Congress should follow the principles of transparency and authenticity on social media, not heavy content control. Regulation, I think, is coming. It needs to be iterative, not heavy. We need to learn as we go. But I think that it is important not to be heavy content control, but to talk about inauthentic sites and enforce the principles of transparency. Last thought, civil society groups in the United States and Europe are going to be the heroes of counter-disinformation techniques. They, not government bureaucracy, are going to be able to expose in real time Russian and other disinformation operations. We ought to put our trust in them. We ought to put some of our resources behind them. People like Jessica Aro and Jakub Kalinski, but others, Stop Fake in Ukraine, the Baltic Elves, EU Disinfo Labs, the Atlantic Council's own DFR Labs. These are the people who can expose, and then when exposed, American society needs to wake up and pay attention to this. There's more to be said, but I'll say it during the questions if there's time.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ms. O'Rourke.